My name is Jim Entz, and I am the coordinator of CHAP, which is the Porterville College Cultural and Historical Awareness Program. This program was organized in 2002 to enhance awareness on campus and in the community for important aspects of our culture to which we might not otherwise be exposed to. Each year, the members of CHAP, including PC faculty, staff, and others, choose a theme for the events. The theme we've been working on this calendar year has been the 20th anniversary of CHAP. We've been going for 20 years here on campus. Starting next lecture, we're going to kick off the theme for the rest of the year, and it is on the Anthropocene. Richard Good is going to be speaking on that on Thursday, October 27th. So that's something to look forward to. Same time and place here on Thursday. Time in the future, right? There we go. Okay, so faculty and staff are encouraged to integrate the theme into their courses, and we very much encourage student participation. For that reason, we are offering extra credit tickets for you to provide evidence for your teachers that you have been here. Either I or a student will be by that door after the event giving out extra credit tickets. So this is available for you there. This CHAP hosts speakers, but also other types of events, panel discussions, exhibitions, concerts, all these sorts of things have been organized under the auspices of CHAP. So all of these events are open to the public, they're free, so I encourage you to come and enjoy them with us. At this point in time, I'd like you to make sure that you take your phone and you silence it, so that we are not interrupted with that, please. Thank you. A little bit about Jay Hargis, the speaker in today's presentation on We Are All Romans. Professor Jay Hargis, well, I would say emeritus or recently retired, has offered classes in history at Porterville College since 1991, first as an adjunct and then as a full-time history professor. Jay Hargis and I were both hired in the same year, so we go way back in that regard. He obtained his bachelor's degree in history from UCLA and his master's degree from CSU Chico. Areas of historical interest that he has explored in 23 previous CHAP and other topical presentations over the years have included Mexican and Mexican-American history, the Cold War, U.S. politics of the 60s and 70s, our Islamic heritage, medieval history, 19th century European conflicts, the legacies of World War I, the U.S. and the Middle East since the 1940s, fictional history in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm especially taken by his writings too. And other topics. He created PC's history major, the history AAT major, and the college's history classes. He also created in world history, California history, Mexican American history, Mexican history, Latin American history, and Middle Eastern history, as well as revising the classes in U.S. history and Western civilization. Quite a resume there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jay Hargis as our speaker for this event. Thank you.
All right. Today's topic, we are all Romans still, in a sense, though we probably don't know that. Those of you studying Roman history in world history or Western Civ or in art history coming up, hopefully this will give you a little bit of context for what you're studying. An empire that ended well over a millennium ago, still continues to influence us today and is a great part of our modern world. So hopefully you'll be able to look around and say, where's that from? Or that's what that's from. And many of you actually speak one of the languages that are one of the daughter languages of the Romans, which is Spanish. If you speak Spanish, you're speaking a version of Latin, their language. So you are probably more Roman than I am, although we've also influenced it in English as well. So anyway, the plan for today then is I'm going to try to get you out of here by 12:15 on the real calendar, not that calendar. And at least we could talk, at least do some questions. And so I encourage you to ask questions. Questions are a way to learn. That's why every instructor asks you to do that, because just sitting there and reading a book or looking at something on a board does not mean you're learning anything. So you need to get involved with it. And challenge me and say you're wrong, you're saying this is wrong, I don't believe you, that sort of thing. That's fine, I'll go with that. Anyway, what we're going to be looking at then today is we'll be a quick little look at Rome's culture, its history, its political structure. There'll be a number of charts, its language, its use of the calendar that we have, and so on. And then at the end, we'll wrap up on all of the important contributions today, the legacy of Rome, in the last 3 slides before the end. So that will hold most of that stuff. So I checked, I can actually read them, so it does work out. Well, we were worried that it would be too many words on a page. I should always learn when you do a PowerPoint, don't put too much information on the page. And I've absolutely forgotten that in doing this one. So I apologize in advance. I won't just read the slide to you, which is what you don't want to do. Anyway, so let's go. Rome, of course, in translating this to PowerPoint, I'm sorry, I apologize about the city there. The city having grown. Rome was founded, at least by their tradition and their history, is 753 BCE. And have any of you been to Rome, modern times? Yeah, 1, 2? I would at 3. Very good. I would encourage you to go because there's still links to the past there. The Roman Forum is there. The ruins of the Colosseum are there. The water system, the sewer system, bridges, roads, they're all still there. You just have to look for them. Unlike, Porterville, we don't have old ancient Porterville back in the 1800s. It's, that's only been 150 years, or only been a little over 100 years. But for Rome, 753 BCE, that's what, 2,700 years that Rome has existed, and the city is still around. It is the first city in the western part of the world outside of China to hit 1 million people. That was one of the reasons why the Romans were so successful. They always had 1 million soldiers that they could throw at people, among other things. It still is the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, which has a name for a reason. It is the present capital of Italy after the Italians finally captured it from the Austrians. And its achievements continue to influence the world, which is really my whole point of this entire lecture. That's the main idea. Rome continues to influence us, the world in the past and the world today. So, did I hit the wrong button? I may have. I'm sorry. There we go. Back to that one. How many of you have seen a picture like this before? Who are the 2 characters? I'm just, see if you remember it. Romulus and Remus, that's correct. This is a very famous statue, and this was called the Capitoline wolf. The Capitoline Hill is where we get the name Capitol for, like, the Capitol building, the Capitol Dome in the United States, and so on. But this famous art piece, originally considered to be Etruscan, the Etruscans were the ones who controlled Rome when it was founded. It turned out to be a medieval forgery. This is actually the one that they have has been found to be. It's actually of the medieval. When they've tested it, it's of the medieval period. But it reflects what Romans had, and that was this myth of the founding of Rome by the 2 founders who were descended allegedly from one of the Trojans who had escaped from the Trojan War by the name of Aeneas. And the wolf, it's kind of like a Moses story where the child was put in a basket floating down a river. In this case, there were 2 of them. The wolf found them, and since the wolf just recently had, they're not pups, I guess they're whelps, and so it decided to suckle them. And so the Romans used the wolf as one of their important symbols. And so whether this is a medieval replica or not doesn't make any difference. It just reflects the fact that this is the beginning of Rome, 753 BCE. BCE means the before the Common Era. We used to say BC, but we don't anymore because that's a religious one. And so even though we're using the exact same calendar, we say BCE. So the Romans for 7 years were under the control of Etruscan kings. And then in the year 509, they overthrew the last king, Tarquinius, and they established the Roman Republic. Now, the word republic is a Roman word. It comes from res publica, Latin words which mean public things. And the republic is what we have. We are a republic. And to the republic for which it stands. And so we're not a democracy. We are a republic. And the difference is a republic is elected representatives who vote. It's a citizen's duty to vote and to serve the state. So we have an election coming up. Dr. Keels will tell you more about that than I can. But you see here this coin, the person voting. And that's what makes a difference. In the Greek world, in Athens, which is the only significant democracy in ancient Greece, the rest of them are monarchies or oligarchies. But we always emphasize a democracy, but we're not a democracy. We are a republic, and we get that directly from the Romans. The Roman Republic, though, was quite tempestuous, is the word. It wasn't like that people, and we'll go through the structure of the government in just a couple slides later, but it wasn't like everybody was happy with this. There were always people who disliked things that were going on. There was always violence. It sounds familiar? Yeah, there were people trying to overthrow the government, prevent people from voting. That happened all the time. And so I don't want to make the Republic sound like it was a wonderful place. It was actually quite difficult, especially if you were a reformer. You might get yourself beaten up and thrown into the Tiber, which is the river that runs along the side of Rome. And that's what happened to some of the more, like the Gracchi brothers, both of them were, who tried to transform Rome. You'll read about them in the world history class. But the Romans always had conflict about this, that people were always fighting for political power. It seemed to work in times of crisis. When the armies would be defeated, the people would come together, the elected officials, who served for only a year in office. So if you didn't like them, they were gone pretty quickly. And if you really didn't like them, you'd sue them afterwards, and then get them exiled or something. Better than in Athens, where they threw pieces of broken pottery at you to get rid of you. So anyway, the Republic lasted until 27 BCE, and in the last century of the Republic, we had serious civil wars that went back and forth between those who wanted to keep things the same and those who wanted to change things, make them more open, and then those people who just wanted power for power's sake. You have to understand all of that is part of the picture, and you don't often get that in movies about the Romans and stuff like that. You often just see, well, there's either good guys or bad guys, and that happens in every culture. So the last of the civil war, there were wars starting in the 100s between Marius and Sulla winning, and then after that were the triumvirate, which you may have probably heard of, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, the three who controlled Rome in the 50s and the 60s, 50s, and early 40s of the BCE, before the Common Era. Eventually, in the wars there, and I won't go into the details because it's fun, but this is not a class to go through the details of the Roman civil wars. Julius Caesar, which is, by the way, how we've learned to mispronounce his name all this time. It should be Julius Caesar. Caesar is the correct Roman or Latin pronunciation. But since Shakespeare taught us to say Julius Caesar, he has a play by that name, it has come into English as there's a lot of things, like a lot of Spanish words that have been misused and have come into English. So, like Taco Bell or something like that. Anyway. But anyway, Julius Caesar became, in the end, in 46 BCE, he defeated all of his rivals. He was made dictator for life, which means that the dictator was a temporary job of 6 months at the most, but he was allowed to sit in the Senate and have in the front, they have all the senators when they're sitting around look at him, and he's at a chair, and if they wanted something, they would have to come out on their knees and they would have to beg for it. And no, the senators did not like that. Especially most of them didn't like Caesar. Caesar had a bad habit of forgiving his enemies, people who hated him. And he said, okay, well, you lost, so now you can, I'm a cool guy, you like me now. That didn't work out. And the picture you see here is a modern painting that shows him being stabbed to death on March 15th, 44 BCE. The Ides of March. Shakespeare has Beware the Ides of March. It's a great play. But Caesar was killed, and in fact, the last one was by a person who he considered his son, Brutus. Yeah, et tu Bruti, yes, exactly, in Latin. And but that created yet another civil war, and I don't want to make this long, but the civil war that followed Caesar's death was between those who had killed him and then those who were trying to avenge him. And eventually his grandnephew, whom he had adopted — adoption is a Roman thing, nobody else had done adoptions before the Romans — his adopted son, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, sometimes called just Octavian, and he was the winner. And he conquered Egypt and captured Cleopatra, but she killed herself, so she didn't show up in his triumph in Rome. But he later became the first emperor, Augustus. So he established the empire. But being the winning general, he had over 100 legions by the time we finished. The legion was about 7,000 men. So he had all of the major power at the end of the Civil War, and there was really nobody to challenge him anymore. And so he was able to remake Rome. His original title was Princeps, and where we get the word prince. So the Romans wouldn't take a king, which is a rex, but they would take a princeps, a first citizen, as he was called. Although today Charles, the princeps of England, of the princeps of Wales, has become now the king of England, and he signs all of his documents as Charles R for Rex, the Roman word for king. So they're still using it in England to this very day. The empire, and there's Augustus, a very famous statue that was found all over the empire. He was very good at advertising, and so he put his picture up, and he was worshipped as a god. And as you know, we just finished the month of August, a couple back, named for Augustus. So. And there's one for Julius Caesar too, July. So he had to make his adopted father the divine Julius, as he was called, which means he's a god. And there was a temple to the divine Julius. So it's crazy. Julius, of course, was his family name. Anyway, you can see the empire geographically. It's spread all over the Mediterranean. And the word Mediterranean is a Latin word, meaning the middle of the earth. And that we also use the term Mar Nostra, our sea, and among others, and Mar Nostrum. And of course, we have Rome in Italy. For those of you who make sure I get the right one here. Here's Rome. And at first they conquered Italy, and then they fought against the Carthaginians down here. And then they won, and so then they conquered this territory here. Then the Greeks had, during the Republic period, the Macedonians, the descendants of Alexander the Great, who still had a large army. This whole area was Greek. The Greeks had allied themselves with Carthage, which was not a good idea, and the Romans then took them down and then established their provinces here. Eventually, they then conquered Asia province, and then Judea in 63. So that's why the Romans were there when the story of Jesus was all about. And then eventually they conquered Egypt under Augustus, the last of it. So most of this stuff was during the Republic. They later went on and expanded all the way into, They expanded this into here for just one, this is the two, between the two rivers. This is modern day Iraq, this is Syria, and of course Arabia. And so this was only for a short time, but they eventually gave up that territory. But they spread all of the stuff that the Romans did, their roads, their cities, their aqueducts, all of the things that they did, they spread this all over the empire. And there's even today, you can still find in many of these parts, even places where they were there only for a brief time, the Roman expansion, and even areas outside, like Germany, again, which was outside the empire for most of the time. So anyway, the empire lasted from, as it said, 27 BCE to 476. That was the end of the Western Empire. What they often don't show you, but it is in the books, is that in 286 they divided the empire right here. They figured that it was too big, it was too hard to control, and so they established the traditional Western Empire and then the Eastern Roman Empire. Yes?
Didn't the Romans make it to Europe?
This is Europe.
Oh, well, I mean like England, Old England.
Yeah, they did. Here's Britain right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they didn't get to Scotland. They put a wall between Britain and Scotland called Hadrian's Wall, and I run on the top of it. They actually went up further, and then they came back. So, but no, they were in Britain, and so, for instance, London was originally, as many places in England were originally a military camp, and so their military camps became cities because it wasn't just that they built a little fort and there was all this stuff, but then people came in to sell things to them, and then they were trading with people in other territories, and then suddenly here you have London, and Paris was another military camp originally. So Lyon in southern France still has one of the best amphitheaters what is it, the Colosseum? They use a different term for it, but that's okay. Anyway, you can still see all of that stuff when you go. So it is the Romans really, except for this part of, your question is, except for this part of Europe, they didn't really influence that at this point. But when they split the empire here, this is the Greek-speaking part for the most part. So Palestine, for instance, where the New Testament story, everybody spoke Greek except for the uneducated people like Jesus, who spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew. And although from where he lived, you could look across a valley and see a Greek city, Sepphoris. It's not in the Bible, but they found it. They found the archaeology of that. And here was this huge city with these beautiful mosaics and so on, and ruins that nobody knew was even there. It just shows the Greek influence in the East. The whole New Testament is in Greek. Even during the period, the Romans, it was a bilingual culture, just like Spanish and English. So anyway, they divided it right here. The western part fell in 476 to the mainly Germanic peoples up here, who came into the empire because they were afraid of the Huns who were coming in from Central Asia. So they came across. They weren't trying to destroy the empire. They wanted to get inside and be safe, not unlike people who want to come to the United States and have a better life. That's what they wanted. They were the immigrants. And eventually, many of the Roman leaders and generals were Germans, and including the very last one, who was a Roman general who would end the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire would last another 1,000 years. So the Roman Empire really didn't end in 476. And so we don't call it the Roman Empire, but we had, here's the fall. It was, again, the division which I was talking about, 286, and then finalized in 395, the Germanic tribes running around. The Franks became the French, and so on. The Helvetii became the Swiss. The Britons, we get the word Britannia from the Britons, and Brittany. And so the last emperor was Romulus Augustulus, a really good name for the first Roman and then the first emperor. And he was deposed by Odoacer, who was a Goth, and he didn't have heavy eyeshadow or anything like that. A Goth was a Germanic people who had come originally from Sweden and had drifted down into Central Europe. But he was not only just a Gothic leader, he was a former Roman general, and he became the first king of Italy. Yes?
Wasn't Romulus Augustulus a little kid?
He was a kid, that is correct. Yeah, there's a movie that actually shows that. Yeah, he was a kid, and he was already under the control of his advisors. And so it wasn't any really big deal. The Eastern Roman Emperor, they didn't cry because they considered the Western Romans. The West, the Latin part of this part had been depopulated for a large part. And the East was still the urban core of the empire because it was where the oldest parts of civilization were. So anyway, the real fall of Rome was when the Eastern Roman Empire ended. And that was 1453. This was Constantinople. Does anybody know what Constantinople is called today? Istanbul. There's a cartoon about that. I used to show it in class. It's a kind of a Disney-esque cartoon of people going with Constantinople. Anyway, so this was, they fell to the Ottoman Turks, and this became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And so Istanbul is not the capital of modern-day Turkey. They moved it to Ankara, to the center of the country, when it became a country in the 1920s. But the Constantinople was responsible for spreading Christianity to Eastern Europe and to Russia. They influenced that. So the Roman influence expanded, not just in the original Rome and then the empire, and then they divided, but then the Eastern Empire went on to expand into areas and spread, especially Christianity and their Greek culture and their alphabet. They created the alphabet that's used. It's a completely different one. If you've ever seen Russian written, you'll know what I'm talking about. So, anyway, on with the show. The Roman language, Latin. I took Latin. I took 4 semesters of Latin when I was at UCLA, and including medieval Latin, because I was going to be a medieval historian. And so anyway, here are some, and I have it on this one. This one has the original Latin words. Before we look at these, just let me zip through this here. Give me a second. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, so the Latin word amare becomes amor. And you can see that in Portuguese, it's amor. In Espanol, amor. Amor in Catalão. Everybody know what Catalão is? Catalan. It's in the northeastern part of Spain where Barcelona is. They speak Catalan. They don't speak Spanish there. The Spanish government's always trying to force them to do stuff. And they always talk about cutting away and creating their own country. Then we have Francés, amor. Romano, Romanian. And then we have Sardo, which is from Sardinia. But they're also spoken in, as you see down here, we have Romansh, which is spoken in Switzerland, Galician, which is spoken in northern Spain, Occitan, which is spoken in Provence in France, and then, of course, Church Latin. So all of these are the daughter languages. We call them the Romance languages, not because you go around kissing people. It's because it means they come from the Romans. It's a Romance language. And like I said, many of you already speak a Romance language. And that's a good thing. Don't think of it as something that's bad. It's a good thing to be bilingual or trilingual, as the case may be. Those of us that have always been trying to learn. I mean, I'm going back to Mexico in 3 weeks. So I get to practice my Spanish, such as it is. But anyway, so you see here, whether we have amare, we have parabola, which became the parola and especially palabra, parole. We also here have domum or casa. Those are the 2 words for house. It's like casa seems to have gone across the board in all of the languages. Domo was retained in Sardinia. Leche, as we say, it's leche in Portuguese as it is in Spanish, though it's spelled differently. It is lac in Latin. Nox for night, and then manducare or comandere for to eat. So you can see that Latin roots, I always have thought, I've actually studied Spanish and Italian and French, and have tried to learn Portuguese so I can go to Brazil. But I've always thought Spanish is the closest to Latin. So when you speak Spanish, there's not a lot of outside influences except for Arabic was brought when the Muslims came in and conquered Spain. So anyway, it is one of the things about Rome is that the language is still spoken thousands of years later in, we would say, vulgar form. In other words, it became less the golden Latin that I studied of the Catilinarian orations and Caesar's history of the Gallic Wars, which I had to read both of those books. So anyway, it is what it is. Then what about the Latin alphabet? It's the alphabet that we use. The Greek alphabet's completely different. And we thought they strongly influenced the Roman Latin alphabet. What letters are missing? There's 3 missing. U, J, and W. Very good. That was because the church, and when it used Latin, found that although, for instance, the letter I was used for both J, so Julius Caesar is really Julius Caesar, or Kaiser, and so they decided to differentiate that by creating the letter J. The letter V was used for both V and for U, and then eventually they needed a sound for W, so they invented the W. So, and you can see the Roman names for each of these. And just like in Spanish, Y is Y, which means Greek eye. So, but anyway, we use the alphabet, and of course the Roman numerals, if you've ever seen the people putting 14s or 13s up, there's still people who use that. But we used Roman numerals, the Western world used Roman numerals until about the 900s when they started using Arabic numbers, they were called. Our numbers are Arabic, although they actually came from India. They're actually Hindu numbers. But through the Arabs and their trade with the West, they began to spread, especially in the Middle Ages. But until then, we used Roman numerals. So there's a long history of that, still in use today. Roman government. Okay, I'll try to make this real quick. The Res Publica, elected representatives, they had assemblies, and they had magistrates, who were the people who were supposed to be taking care of the government, and then the assemblies for voting and making policy. Every Roman was a member of a tribe. Every Roman was a member of a century. So you have the tribal assembly and the centuriate assemblies at the bottom, who were predominantly ordinary people, which are called plebeians. The term plebeian is still used in the military academies. The young people going into the academy, they're called plebes, even to this day, for plebeian. The patricians, that were the rich, and the families who had been around at the founding of Rome, they controlled most of the other positions. The plebes eventually, through a horrible civil war, got the right to elect tribunes. A tribune had the power to veto. You've heard that word before. The tribune could stop anything from happening in any of the assemblies by simply saying veto, which means I forbid. Or should be veto, actually, not veto. It's an American mispronunciation. The green shows the cursus honorum, the ladder, cursus honorum, of honor. How you moved up the scale in the government. You started out as a quaestor, financially, so you do the financial stuff first, not last. That's why you should study economics. Then we had the aediles, so they're the ones who set up the games and stuff like that. You had to be rich to be an aedile because you had to pay for it. None of this was using government funds, by the way. Then we had the praetors, who often were the judges, but you also could hold a military command as a praetor. And then you had the consuls. There were two consuls. This is the executive part of the three branches of government, the two consuls who took the place of the king, the rex. They couldn't have a king, so they didn't trust him. So they had two consuls. They each served for a year. They didn't always get along. They often tried to undo what the other one was doing. They sometimes absolutely hated it. The Caesar's co-consul Bibulus spent his whole time being like Caesar's men would come by and dump sewage on top of him and stuff like that. So we haven't quite gotten that bad yet in our country, but it may happen. You never know. It's close, as Leslie was saying. So, okay. And eventually, though, if you were a praetor or you were a consul, after your term, after your term, you became a senator. The Senate comes from the Latin word senex, which means old man. And our Senate is still mainly made of old men today here in the United States. We haven't gotten over that yet. We have some old women in there, but it's mainly old. And we have two senators from every state. California was only the only state that had two women senators for the longest time. One of them became vice president, so now we have one of each. But senators serve for 6 years. They serve longer than the president does. They often are in there for decades because they become a name that people know, and when they go to vote, they vote them in again and again and again, whether they like them or not. And but the Roman senators could nullify what the assemblies were doing. I mean, this is how the system really worked. The assemblies looked like they were going to pass this bill or that bill, and sometimes the leaders would use the assemblies to do what they want. But the Senate could always say, no, we're not going to do that. And they literally used their power because they often were the people who commanded the military, the senators. And the former consuls and the former praetors, they were called proconsul, which is a term we still use, and propraetor. They often had the military commands. As the republic expanded, they needed people to control the territories. They used people who are former officials at the top. Then we also had the censors. There's a term we still use, censorship. The censors were those who looked around and said, okay, everybody over here is citizens, you are not citizens. They would check your citizenship and then determine. So you could lose it, and then you could gain it back. To whoever, make sure the censor was on your side. And so then we have the dictator at the very top, which is a temporary position. You're supposed to be like Cincinnatus, serve, and then go home and be a farmer again. That wasn't going to happen anymore. The dictator became too much temptation for people. So this is why the Republic fell apart. Because again, although this is the ideal, this is not always how it worked. And again, our government has an ideal in the Constitution, and we have people who are not willing to follow the Constitution for one reason or another. So anyway, we should learn from the Romans. Roman law. The main thing to talk about the Roman law is that these are called the 12 tables. They're the basis for the Napoleonic Code, which is used in the rest of the world except for the United States. Some Roman laws are made their way into our system, but it's mainly one used in other parts of the world. Mexico, for instance, uses the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon took Roman laws and basically just put his name on it and changed a few things for modern times. The key thing about this was that all Romans are accountable to the law. You could be a dictator and you still were accountable. We still have people who want to resist being accountable in this country. I won't name any names. Anyway, so the 12 tables, the actual tables were destroyed when the Goths came in and sacked Rome in the 300s BCE. But they put a little spot saying this is where the 12 tables stood. So they had a little memorial building there. Roman society, the senatorial class, eventually, at the end of the Republic, we had essentially patricians, the rich, the powerful, the families of the famous people, like Julius Caesar's Julian family. They claimed to be descended from the goddess Venus. And so anyway, and then eventually the wealthy plebeians worked their way up so that they got accepted as well. The one thing about being in the Senate is you could not be involved in commerce or trade. You could only be a farmer, or you couldn't have a business. They didn't want you doing other things. So there's no outside businesses. We kind of try to do that in our country. We try with the president. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, then we had the equites, who were the horsemen. We get equus, horse, means horse. This was a business class that were often patricians, and many of them were extremely wealthy, and so they could buy their way into the Senate like Crassus did in the era right before Julius Caesar. Plebeians, mostly ordinary poor people who lived in Rome and the cities, and this was farmers outside of Rome who eventually became Roman citizens, and then people in the city. Some of them were rich, some of them were poor, and some of them were unemployed. There were lots of unemployed people in Rome. And then Roman citizens could come in from outside, like the Apostle Paul, when he came to Rome. He was a Roman citizen, so you couldn't crucify him. He could be beheaded. He had the right to during the early empire, he had the right to appeal to Caesar, have his case heard by Caesar, because every Roman magistrate could be a judge. And a jury. They didn't really use jury. They had juries in civil cases. Roman citizens who came in from outside were there. Then you had freedmen, people who had formerly been slaves, and although they had slave revolts during the Republic, some major ones like Spartacus, and then there were 2 or 3 revolts on the island of Sicily, huge ones. So a lot of people were murdered. But by the early empire, freedmen became the people who worked for the government. They were loyal, they were respectable because they were now free. They had good talents. They had good financial. The Emperor Claudius's entire government was run by freedmen, and he just sat around doing not a whole lot. And then of course there were slaves, lots and lots and lots of slaves. Rome was not different from other ancient societies in having slaves, but in Rome, slaves could be freed for all kinds of reasons. You could be a great athlete, a great gladiator. You could be freed. You could be, when a person died, they would often free their slaves. So you wouldn't see freed slaves in other cultures, but you see it in Rome. And as I said, that class of freedmen became more and more and more important over time. And some of them eventually had descendants who became members of the Senate. So you could, and there, some of the emperors eventually, I mean, they came from strange parts of the empire, like what's now Yugoslavia or Slovakia and places like that, or Arabia at the time. So anyway, it was a society that was open later on to moving forward, being mobile. I need to move on here. So Rome's societal institutions was the family. The familia was the most important thing. Your family was where your primary loyalty lay. One of the things about the ancient Romans was that you kept, if you had a famous member of the family, you got a bust of him or her that you kept in the house. So one of the things we have in Roman art is incredibly accurate busts of what people looked like. Ancient Greeks made everybody try to make them look out to be beautiful. They weren't trying to make people, they were making ideas of beauty. And I'm sure you take the art class from Professor Hens. But the Romans worked on the busts of making real people, guys with warts, bald heads, big bellies. They were all, they you know, what they could show. They did all that. They didn't care because it was more important to have the family member there that you would remember. And remembering family members is a big deal. The pater familias, the head of the family, had authority. He could have all the children killed, and nobody would blink. He had the power of life and death over all the children and people in his family. He was often a patron for people that were poor. They would come to him and ask for favors, and they would become clients. The term as we still use today. Client was the Latin word. And he literally he could divorce his wife. Of course, she could divorce him. It was no big deal. Divorce was very common, but family being the important thing here. So the gens or the familia. Marriage and divorce. Marriages are alliances between families, and divorce is like, I don't like you, I can't live with you anymore, I want to marry somebody else. So that's what they did. And they also did adoptions. So your family could grow, especially if you had a child, the parents die, and then, or the parents are poor and they want their son adopted into a family of somebody who's more powerful. And they would often do that. That's how Julius Caesar's grand nephew, coming from a sort of a podunk farm family out in the countryside, got him adopted by Julius Caesar as his son. And he went on to become the emperor. So, anyway. Sexuality, people always ask questions about that. They were supposed to, honor their vows. Men didn't have to. Women got in trouble if they didn't. Of course, it's a male-dominated society, and of course that hasn't changed too much. If you look at the world, sex with one's slaves was actually expected. Slaves had no choice, so that's rape, essentially, right? And male homosexuality was the Greeks thought that was a cool kind of love. The Romans were a little bit, not really. But as long as you were the one who was the dominant one, you were okay. Your manhood being challenged by being the passive one, that's a different story. You would never be elected to anything. You would not get any honors. People would talk about you behind your back. The whole thing. Caesar was accused of that, although he went around sleeping with half the women in Rome when he was before he became the leader. So anyway, but that was there were no restrictions on women. We have lots and lots of female love poetry back and forth, and letters. We found the letters of these things. Male, not much, just a few. But again, for men, that would be taking a big chance to be the non-dominant one. So. It's a different world, or how much to say. Roman religion, there's no separation between church and state. Almost every magistrate had some religious job as well. Julius Caesar, when he was a senator and a general, and so on, he was also the Pontifex Maximus, which means he was the supreme priest. And he did special duties. And today, who is the Pontifex Maximus? The Pope. It's one of the titles that he's taken. And so the Romans saw themselves as highly religious. We have piety. We are very nice people. And the God and our success is based on being pious. The Romans were also polytheistic. They would worship any god. We got 10, we got 20. You got a new one? Well, let's worship that one too. They were not exclusive. The idea of exclusive God like the Jews, That was crazy. Why would you do that, they would think. This is the Roman reaction to something like Judaism. They tolerated the Jews because they had an ancient religion. And as far as they were concerned, that meant that they were cool. Christianity, when it came along, that's a different story. It's something new, and it's not real. The Jews had an advantage in Rome because of that. There was never any persecution of Jews in Rome. There was a war against the Jews in Palestine. That was a different story. But not any persecution of Jews. It would later be Christians who would persecute Jews in the Middle Ages and beyond, up through the Nazis and so on, in our own time. Early Roman religion had been influenced by the Etruscans. The Greeks were nearby, so they picked up the Greek gods and changed their names to the ones that they had been using before. They looked at to match them up. And so their idea was basically, I give to you so that you may give to me. I will give you sacrifices. And sacrifice was generally lighting a fire or something like that. It wasn't like, there was no male sacrifices or people sacrifices or stuff like that. The Etruscans had done that, but the Romans didn't do it. But the idea was if you're pious and you follow the gods, they will take care of you later on. So we'll see if it works. Okay, so that's Marcus Aurelius. Roman Christianity. Christianity became centered in Rome. That's the key point I want to make here. It moved from Palestine to Rome. You'd think Jerusalem would have been the center of the Christian world. And it was originally. But things changed, especially Peter and Paul, the two most important apostles. Paul spreading Christianity across the Greek world and going to Rome, which already had a small Christian congregation. He was there during the Neronian persecution in the 60s. And then Peter, also who he often disagreed with, who had been one of the top apostles, came to Rome, and both of them were executed in Rome. Peter was, according to tradition, crucified upside down because he was not a Roman citizen. Paul was beheaded. And there's a church called the Church of Peter and Paul in Rome. There's also allegedly in the Vatican, at the main church, Peter's tomb is supposed to be under the high altar. They found a box with bones in it that said, "Here lies Peter." Could be. Again, it's a matter of faith. Romans. So having the two most important apostles in Rome, Rome being the center of the empire, all the roads leading to Rome, Rome became the center of Christianity, and so when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the Common Era 70, and then they came back and destroyed it again in 135, I believe. Modern Jerusalem, for people who go to Jerusalem, and I've had some friends and colleagues here at the college who've taken church trips to Jerusalem so they can walk where Jesus walked. That city's not there anymore. It's a medieval city. Because the Romans were very good at destroying cities. They destroyed everything. There was nothing left. They renamed the city Aelia Capitolina, which means to the Capitoline gods. And they put up a temple where the Jewish temple had been, the whole thing. So later that was all torn down by the Muslims. But we like to think that the Neronians were the ones who did the worst. I need to end pretty quickly. The worst persecutions. It was actually in the 300s under the Diocletian and the others. It's called the Great Martyrdom, I guess. 312, the Emperor Constantine tolerated Christianity. He gave Christianity credit for him winning the emperorship. He didn't become a Christian until his deathbed, though. At least that's what the story is. It wasn't until he wanted to unify the empire, which is why he did it. It wasn't until 380 that Christianity was finally made the official religion of the empire. And even then, it was a minority. Only about 40% of the population at the most were Christian. But they were using that to try to unify the empire. But by 380, the old Rome is on its way out, and the new Rome, Constantinople, is created as a uniquely Christian city in the early 300s. Roman art, the key things are the sculpture that we talked about. Look at that face of that old man up there. These are all things that say, look at that woman's hair style. I don't know if any of you could do that, but you want your hair up. And there must have been some structure holding it up. Frescoes are the paintings that were on the walls. They were on wet plaster. That survived into the period of the Renaissance. Again, were frescoes. Some of the most important frescoes, especially the inside the church in Rome? The one with the Last Supper. Da Vinci's. In Milan. No, the one, I'm thinking the one that, is it that in Milan?
Yeah.
Okay, so are the ones there, and then also inside the
Oh, you're talking about down.
Yes.
Herculaneum.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so on.
But anyway, the frescoes are still an important part of Christian art through this entire period. And of course, mosaics. This is a picture of a mosaic. The Romans and then later the Byzantines did beautiful mosaics. Absolutely gorgeous mosaics. Thousands of tiny little colored stones, laying them down so that from a distance they look like it's painted. So those are the key elements of Roman art, and sorry to not give it all the attention. Take Mr. Ence's class. And Roman engineering, again, here's some key things: roads, aqueducts. They invented concrete, and we still use cement. They're the inventors of cement. That way you could build things like domes. And you see the dome of the Pantheon there with the light coming through the oculus at the center. If you go to Rome, you've got to go to the Pantheon. And does anybody know what the ceiling of the Pantheon was copied somewhere? It's the inside of the U.S. Capitol. Looks exactly, except for the oculus. In the U.S. Capitol, where the oculus is, there's a painting of George Washington receiving people into heaven. He's in his military uniform, and he's in heaven with angels, ready to accept all of these alleged senators and congressmen and stuff. Anyway, aqueducts, Roman roads, they still use Roman roads. They built apartment buildings, like 3 to 4 story apartment buildings in Rome. Trajan's Market was the first mall. They had a 3-story building that had little cubby holes where you could set up businesses. Parts of it are still there in Rome today. Tunnels, sewers, bridges, harbors. They even took concrete that they could lay underwater and create harbors. That's pretty dang sophisticated. So, sorry I can't talk about it. The calendar. We're in October. Now, if you know your numbers, this should be we call it the 10th month. But what is It's really the 8th month. The Roman months were intercepted by Julius and Augustus. And that's why September, which should be the 7th month, is now the 9th month. And December, which was the 10th month, is now the 12th month. The Roman calendar had 12 months. January is the name for the god Janus, who looks both forwards and backwards. He looks like last year and to this new year. It's pretty cool, actually. So, and you'd have to look up what all the gods are here for the most part. But these are named after people. All the planets are named after Roman gods. I mean, this is so that even in countries where there's no Roman traditions like China and Japan and so on, they use the same names of the planets that we do. Everybody wants to go to Mars or to Luna, to the moon. Nobody wants to go to Mercury, so for good reason. Okay, and of course Pluto also, but Pluto's been dumped from the planet map. So anyway, so you know your gods: Jupiter being the king of the gods, Saturn being his father, Uranus being his brother, and so on. Roman geography, we still use, like in Greece, Graecia, Britannia, Hispania, is where we get Spain and Hispanic, Gallia from Gallic, Germania, Germany, and of course Asia. This little province of Rome called Asia eventually was called the rest of Eurasia, was called Asia. The little part down here, this is Africa province. The rest of the continent, Afro-Eurasia, was named for that little spot, which is now Tunisia. So Roman names continue even though they've been expanded from the original ones. Okay, so Byzantium, this is the Eastern Roman Empire. There's Constantinople with the Hippodrome, which was famous for chariot races and for rabid fans and for colors. Each team had colors, and people, like they had done in Rome, they bet on sports, and they had rioted and they beat each other up when they didn't like the way things were going. Very famous riots in Constantinople based on chariot races. So, yeah, is it an insurrection? Well, almost was. Constantinople became the new Rome. And of course, this was the largest Christian church that has now Muslim towers that were added to it, and that's Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom. It was a church. It became a mosque. Then when the state of Turkey was created, the government, they made it into a museum, and now the current government, which is Muslim, made it into a mosque again. So be careful what you say in there. All right. Now, this is basically a repetition of what we talked about. So we still have law, which I've gone into. Haven't talked much about literature, but it's still there. History writings and everything are still read. English, again, 30% of English is Latin. Still uses the Latin alphabet. Most European languages also do that as well. Architecture we've talked about. Most sports arenas are based on the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus. Pantheon, again, Roman baths or spas, and also like athletic gyms. That was what a Roman bath was, because you did all kinds of exercise and stuff as well, and had slaves there to take care of you. Trajan's market, again, we had malls and office complexes. Romans built multi-storied apartment buildings. Roman buildings, like I said, are still standing. Ruins, roads, aqueducts, tunnels, bridges, and sewers are still there. Romans developed the way we organize time. 365-day calendar is a Roman, under the Julian calendar, as it was. All the months, dividing the day into 24 hours, assimilation of some Roman holidays, like the Roman, what was the holiday? The Roman, in December 25th was, oh, my brain is going here.
Saturnalia.
Thank you, Saturnalia for Saturn, and that became Christmas. Now, Jesus wasn't born in December because there were shepherds in the fields. If that's true, he would have been born in April. There's no shepherds wandering around Palestine in the wintertime. Sorry. But that's assuming that all of that is, accurate. Anyway, so that, and then also our government is an imitation. The Senate, 3 branches of government, checks and balances, and the veto. Roman citizenship, we talked about. Revolutionary France also modeled itself. Both countries used the same Roman symbolism, especially the eagle. Sorry to go so fast. I'm my own worst enemy here. The empire influenced the terminology of empires over the centuries. Charlemagne, Napoleon, the British Empire, Mussolini recently all copied themselves after the Romans to a certain extent. But also in popular culture, we have the Galactic Empire in the Asimov books. And then we have the evil empire in Star Wars, all based on this idea of this vast, huge empire. Roman terms are used for titles. Imperator became emperor, princeps became prince, rex became king, dux became duke, comes became count, and then Kaiser and Tsar comes from Caesar. So still, those items are still with us. And lastly, the military is a standard for modern military, having officers and non-commissioned officers. Roman military were professionals. They were not just some farmer who rose up and fought. That was the way it was at the beginning. By the time of the empire, the armies were professional soldiers, like ours are. And they had to serve duty for like 20 years. And they got paid well, though. Command structure, we talked about military symbolism, the eagle, cities that were once military camps, mass entertainment, professional athletes and teams with distinctive colors, fans and so on, and celebrity athletes, sports, statistics, and gambling were all part of the Roman world. Does that sound unfamiliar? They were an urban civilization. They were the first large city with more than 1 million in the West. They had the problems that we have: overcrowding, pollution, sanitation, traffic control, sufficient water, noise, fires, rioting, crime, and underemployment. They dealt with a lot of this by bringing in water. Roman citizens, people in Rome had more water per capita than we do today because they had so many aqueducts aqueducts didn't have to be big structures. They could be at the ground level. The fountains all over the city still watered by some of those. And they also gave out free grain, free wheat. It's called the bread, the dole. It's welfare. They gave people food so you could grind it up and make bread. So the government did this as a way to keep people from rioting. So it's a type of welfare. So the empire was multicultural, and eventually they accepted all the different cultures and said anybody living in the empire is a citizen. They tried to keep it just to Rome itself, then they expanded it to Italy, to their allies first, and then the rest of Italy. They had to fight a war over that. Then as they began to expand, eventually under the Emperor Caracalla, they basically said anybody in the empire is a citizen. So it would have been different for Peter if he'd only lasted a few centuries more. So anyway, that is it. This is the symbol of Rome, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romae, the Senate and the people of Rome. And so, of course, their eagle. Any questions? Sorry to take so long. Yes?
You referred to the wealthy elite in the country. Did education have anything to do with it?
No. Everybody would have had a Greek tutor when they were growing up. The wealthy would have had that. But many of the upper class families weren't always wealthy. Like the Julians were kind of on their way down until Julius Caesar kind of bumped them back up. And it wasn't education, it was the fact that he was politically strong. It was who you were and what member family you were and how effective you were at getting power, rather than education, unfortunately. Yes?
Did the fall of Western Rome have anything to do with what happened after, like, whenever the Holy Roman Empire came about? Is that like direct?
Yeah, what they're trying to do is that when the Western Empire fell, you had the Germanic people settling into different parts. The Visigoths were in Spain, the Ostrogoths, the East Goths were in Italy, and so on and so on. So in Britannia, you had the Anglo-Saxons and so on. But what happened was they set up kingdoms. And eventually, in the year 800, they brought the Frankish kingdom, which was working with the papacy. They came together. The King Charles of the Frankish kingdom came down to celebrate Christmas in Rome, and while he was there, allegedly, the Pope walked up, put a crown on his head, and said, "You are the Emperor Charles," and he became Charles the Great, Charlemagne. And so that was an attempt to create another empire. The Eastern Empire said, "He's not an empire, he's just a Frank." And so it took a long time for them to accept that there would be a new empire. And that empire lasted, it broke apart, and it came together in different pieces all the way up through the end of World War I, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the heir of the old empire, the Holy Roman Empire that you were talking about, which was in the Middle Age, in Renaissance period. So, yeah. Yes?
Earlier, you kind of briefly mentioned the Rackard brothers. Do you think there might be a pair of Rackard brothers in America?
These are ones that were willing to put their life on the line to bring a progressive change. As we would call it, progressive change. They were still wealthy people of the upper patrician class. And that was why they were killed, because they were so...
And they were populist too, right?
Yeah, they were populist by the standards of and each one had a group of guys who basically to protect them. They're like a little army that went around and beat up people that disagreed with them. So it could happen today, yeah. I mean, there are people who are willing to fight for what they think is progressive change. So I don't know. Again, I wouldn't put my life on the line. I'm sorry. I'm old, and I want to make it to being older. So, but that's a young man's fight. At least at that time it was. And unfortunately, both of them were treated horribly and beaten up and then thrown into the Tiber. So you'll read about it in a book. At least it should be in there. Western Civ covers it in more detail. Any last questions? You guys were very good. Thank you for being patient with me. I mean, I went over my time by 20 minutes. So I haven't done this in a while.
Self-imposed time.
I know.
Right on time.
I know. Thank you.